You're welcome to this event.
Just joined in. Have we started?
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. You are most welcome to this online event where we celebrate and jointly reflect on the future of learning for our children during these uncertain times of COVID-19. Our specific theme will be unveiling Uwezo Uganda at 1 during challenging times. And we shall be reflecting on the implications of COVID-19 on children's learning. Before we start, I would like to introduce myself. I am called Farida Nasereka. I work as a senior program officer at Uwezo Uganda. And I warmly welcome you and appreciate all the efforts you've put in to join us this morning as we reflect, as we celebrate our 1 year, and as we continue to focus on how we shall continue to think through the approaches and reflecting on the implications of COVID-19 on learning and education in general. We warmly welcome you and would kindly request that all participants please mute when you're not talking, and let's use the chat room for questions and comments. Would also like you to introduce yourselves kindly through the chat room by stating your name and the institution or organization where you're from. And it will help us know who the participants in this event are as we continue with the event. In a special way, we would like to acknowledge the presence of our category of partners we have worked with in the past, we continue to work with, and we believe we'll continue on this journey together with our respected partners. We have with us our board of Uwezo Uganda. We have among the participants our technical advisory committee that has been at the back of all activities that we do, advising us in whatever activities and operations that we've continued to undertake. We have government representatives in this meeting, especially from the Ministry of Education and Sports, as well as the related agencies from the National Curriculum Development Center. We have development partners and our funders who have continued to support us along this journey we have taken. We have the academia, the media, and we greatly appreciate the partnership we've always had with all of you. We have CSOs represented in this meeting, various platforms, including the UNATU, that is the Uganda National Teachers Union, the Forum for Education NGOs in Uganda, and other education-related CSOs. We have representatives from our broader family of the PAL network and our family at Uwezo, as well as our district partners, and RELI, which is the Regional Education Learning Initiative. We continue to acknowledge your presence, even for those who are continuing to link in via Zoom. We appreciate that. We greatly value the collaboration and partnerships that have seen us this far. They have been powerful and have really enabled us set forth on this powerful and robust journey that we have continued to take, especially on addressing educational challenges amidst these tough times. We would like to highlight our structure as Uwezo, that is headed by our board, whose chair is Professor Albert Lutalo Bosa and his team. We would also like to acknowledge the presence of our technical advisory committee members. We've seen Mr. Kaboyo amongst the participants, but we would also like to acknowledge the leadership of this technical advisory committee led by Dr. Albert Biamugisha, Your support has really been unwavering throughout this year, and it has enabled us draw lessons, reflect on the programs that we do, and we believe it will continue to set us forth on this journey. As we celebrate Uwezo at One, we would like to share our journey that we have taken this far, and with that reflect on how we have endured through these tough times, especially focusing on the core area of learning and education that is at the center of all that we do. So as we celebrate, and with the theme of focus, that is jointly reflecting on the future of learning for our children, we would like to take us briefly through a few slides that we will share on with you, and then reflect on where we have come from and where we are heading. So looking at this slide, we are celebrating 1 year, but there are so many questions that come at the back of our minds and that we need to reflect on. As we celebrate this first year, we would like to think through what we have done, where we have come from, and where we think we are heading to. So our history, many of us quite well know. We've been partners in this. We initially were a program of Uwezo East Africa, and we have seen many of our colleagues join in. We really appreciate. We are a family, and when we walk this journey that we set forth alone, we know you are always at the back, patting us and pushing us forward and fronting us to deliver on the many activities and outcomes that we set out to achieve. So before 2020, we were mainly working with citizens to generate independent evidence on children's basic literacy and numeracy skills. And with that, we were mostly undertaking the Uwezo learning assessments, for which we broadly contributed to discussions and actions towards improving learning, not only in Uganda, but across the East African region, and also in a way in the Global South through our partnership with the PAL network. So we use this evidence to engage with policy actors and citizens for action to address the learning crisis. And as we look at that, we shall also see how the current COVID pandemic is actually impacting on the learning crisis, and how we shall continue to address such a challenge. We also raised citizens' awareness of the need for effective learning and to strengthen the demand for improvements in the quality of education. Of course, this was an ambitious agenda that we had set on, and it will continue also to reflect, to impact, to also kind of influence the approach we decided to take as an independent entity. So in 2019, we developed a 4-year strategy that would set us forth on this journey between 2020 and 2023 to front us as an independent entity and look through the contributions that would make on improving the education on improving and addressing education challenges in Uganda. So our vision within our 4-year strategy was that of a society in which all children are learning and realizing their full potential. And again, within that 4-year strategy, we developed our mission, which we are continuing to pursue, and that is to demonstrate how to improve learning outcomes and keeping communities and leaders focused on learning. And by doing so, we planned to conduct that through assessments, research, innovations, partnerships, and advocacy in order to realize our mission. We developed 4 strategic goals in this 4-year journey. And the first goal is that of conducting assessments of learning. We recognize the importance of the assessments that we had always been doing and how they reflect on the strategy and the need to continue addressing the gaps in learning outcomes as we set forth in this 4-year journey. So with that goal, our focus is to produce independent evidence on the learning levels of children, their distribution, and factors associated with them. And with that, we shall continue to conduct the assessments of basic learning in numeracy and literacy, to continue identifying the gaps and the importance of foundational learning skills in addressing educational challenges. At the same time, we shall also conduct assessments of young people's literacy and numeracy skills to demonstrate the importance of the foundational skills and the spillover to higher levels, especially when the young people advance to the world of work and in everyday life. So the linkage between those 2 assessments would be to continue fronting the issue of learning outcomes being central to improvements. The second goal is to research and experiment. And with this, would focus on carrying out research and promoting innovations that have the potential to improve the level and distribution of learning outcomes in basic education. And here we'll focus on undertaking various researches and studies, including on studying the preschool arena and how it can contribute to improving learning, as well as studying issues around absenteeism, both of learners and pupils, as being central to addressing the gaps in education. And our goal 3 will be focusing on engagements where we shall engage with policy actors and with the public to influence and promote policies and practices for improved and more equitable learning outcomes. And here we shall do a lot of advocacy, as well as continue our communications work that is focusing on addressing the gaps or the findings from what goal 1 and goal 2 will be presenting to ensure that there is continuous improvements and uptake by policy actors to really address those gaps and challenges, and with a focus on yielding improvements. Then our goal 4 will specifically be addressing institutional development, where we will and hope to establish and develop Uwezo Uganda as an independent, not-for-profit organization with the capacity and resources to execute its mission effectively. So as we move further, we need to reflect on the gaps that we hope to address. We need to reflect on the goals that we have highlighted, and also share how we have managed during these challenging times. We will highlight what we have done, where we are heading, what are the implications in the context of learning and education broadly. And at this juncture, I would like to welcome Dr. Goreti Nakabugo, who is the Uwezo Executive Director, to lead us through this journey of reflecting with specific focus on our theme on reflecting on Uwezo Uganda at one during these challenging times. You're welcome, Dr. Goretti.
Thank you very much, Farida. Thanks a lot for the wonderful introduction of today's event. I'll just request to remove my mask for purposes of audibility, but we are living in very hard times where the cases of COVID-19 in Uganda are spiking and the number of deaths are increasing. So putting on our masks is no longer optional. It's something that we need to do. So I request the rest of the people around me to put on their masks as I remove mine. Thank you very much. So it's really a great honor to welcome everyone to this event. And we know that it's a very difficult time when everybody is closing their office due to the festive seasons. But we thank you very much for creating this time to be with us. We thought about this really. Yes, it's hard times. The year is coming to an end. But should we just close the year like that? And that's when an idea came to us that we transitioned as an independent organization in difficult times, in these challenging times. We need to end the year by celebrating where we have come from, but also reflecting on the journey ahead. So, but before I go any further into the reflection, allow me to send apologies from our founder, the founder of Uwezo East Africa, which was our mother organization before we transitioned at the end of last year. And he also is the founder of Uwezo, Mr. Rakesh Rajan, who is the vice president currently of Co-Impact International. He couldn't make it because of the huge time difference, but he's here with us in spirit. The chair of our board, Professor James Albert Lutalo Bosa, is also on the way coming. So much as they are not yet here, they are really with us in spirit. And thank you once again, all of you, for joining us. So Farida ended by showing our very ambitious agenda for the next 4 years. So we had just taken off in our first year of operation, about 2 months, hardly actually 3 months, that the COVID-19 emergence began in 2020. For us, this was a very real test to our resilience. We asked ourselves, can we really survive this? But in all this, we prioritized staff safety, and retention was our priority. So I'm very happy to say that as we celebrate our first year and close the year as we prepare to enter into the new year, that none of our staff has fallen sick from COVID-19, and we were able to retain all our staff, which was not a mean achievement. But we also wanted, much as there was this shock, to maintain some critical work that responded to the emergency, and we wanted to be aligned with the Ministry of Education and Sports so that we made that impact. But also, most of all, was to remain open to our donors, our funders, and having an open communication and conversation with them. We told them, look here, if you remove any resources from us, this is the end of Uwezo Uganda, because we are just taking off, we cannot survive this. And at this juncture, I want to add to the voice of Farida to acknowledge the support and understanding of our funders, the major one being FCDO, Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, under the CECIL project. CECIL stands for Strengthening Education Systems for Improved Learning. That's the joint program between the Ministry of Education and the UK government. We acknowledge one of our anonymous funders. It's a philanthropic fund. They're very modest. They don't want to be mentioned unnecessarily, but we acknowledge them. And then our mother organization, Uwezo East Africa, who gave us startup funding. Without their support, we wouldn't even be here celebrating today. So how did we respond to this? So besides wanting to maintain a certain level of program work under our 4 strategic goals, which Farida shared, we deliberately adapted our work, some of our work, to ensure that we responded to the current situation and in the process responding to the crisis, which was in our face. So the first area in which we responded was to ensure that we also contributed to the continuation of learning. Like I'll show you in the next slides, our schools have been closed since March, since 20th March, and up to now. So we wanted to be part of the efforts to ensure that much as students or children were not in school, we also contributed to their learning while they were at home. So number one, we participated in the Ministry of Education COVID-19 response plan. And in that way, we mainly contributed to advocate inclusion of printed materials, in addition to what was being planned, lessons on radio, a few on TV. Wanted to ensure that in all that effort, there should be text or reading materials reaching the children, because we know that in Uganda, and I think in most developing countries, the only text that children get exposed to are the school notes. So when schools were closed, they had nothing to read. And we also, so that is something that successfully worked. And Ministry of Education in its response plan produced some materials for radio lessons, but also materials for self-study. And we worked very closely with the National Curriculum Development Center, especially on the lower primary materials for the first phase, to ensure that they were developed, but also that they reached at least a selected number of children in their homes. We also mounted a campaign, a short messages SMS campaign, to over 4,500 of our partners spread in various districts, over 30 districts. And these messages were mainly about safeguarding, to ensure that, yes, let's contribute. Yes, our children are not in school, but they should also remain safe when they are at home. The other one was to share, just continuously share some reading materials in form of a short paragraph, which we asked our partners, those 4,500 and more, to ask their children to read for them. So the example there is one of the materials which was designed, developed by the Ministry of Education and Sports with the leadership of National Cultural Development Center. That's for primary one, but materials were developed actually for all classes. Just a sample where we contributed. Next. And these are just extracts of the messages from the SMS campaign. You can see, like in the first box, that's the safeguarding message from us, saying control the numbers of people coming into your home and the frequency of movement out of the home. But we partnered with an SMS company, which could also help us to get feedback from the recipients on whether they had taken action, whether they were planning to take action or no action at all. And the other one is just an example of the paragraphs we kept sharing with our partners to ask their kids to read for them. And the beauty of this SMS campaign was that you didn't need to have a smartphone. Any phone could actually be used as a learning tool, teaching and learning tool. Other responses that we did, here we share 3 studies that we conducted during the school shutdown and during this period of the pandemic. The first one was a joint study with the Uganda Kingdom Education Department and Mutesa One Royal University. Uganda Kingdom Education Department was actually leading on this, and we contributed in terms of technical and then resources. to ensure that, yes, government did not only give out materials out there to children, but were they reaching the children? How were people using actually the materials? This study is going actually to be launched officially by Uganda Kingdom tomorrow, and we shall share insights from that. But overall, I mean, just to preempt the study, we found that in the districts where we did it, there were 4 districts, about only 20% of the kids of the households had received these self-study materials. So, but again, we can celebrate that something had been done. Then we did the CSO study to try and establish the capacity for local organizations for education advocacy, which is critical, especially in this moment. And then partnership with Hello World, which is an organization which is intervening in Uganda through the use of ICT to ensure that there is improved learning outcomes in 1 district in Uganda. So partnering with them, we compared what would happen if we did a learning assessment face-to-face, which Uwezo actually conducted, and then what happened if we do the same assessment now via telephone. And the findings are also quite interesting. Of course, somehow showing that kids did a little bit better when it was telephone assessment. Of course, you cannot rule out the fact that there's always that external assistance when you are not there watching. But overall, for all these 3 studies, we were not only collecting data, but we were also testing a methodology of collecting data at a distance to ensure that we safeguarded ourselves, but also safeguarding the respondents in the study. And it worked pretty fine. The last one is a global campaign in which we participated. It was led by the Education Commission. It's an international organization with so many other international organizations, including the Asian Development Bank and so many others. It's a campaign on Save Our Future, which resulted into a production of a white paper on education, documenting experiences from all over the world, and really advocating for the fact that, yes, this pandemic is going to be with us. How do we ensure that eventually there is a safe reopening of schools so that we save our future? But not only just reopening anyhow, but reopening these schools in a safe way. And we contributed to one of the background papers in partnership with other organizations on teaching at the right level. This is just an extract from our civil society organization study, which involved 30 organizations, which we partnered with. We partnered with these 30 organizations to conduct the learning assessment 2018, and the findings are ready, but this is just an insight into, you can see that they are involved in a number of education advocacy, and they raise a number of issues, including issues on poor learning outcomes and many, many others. So there is potential here actually to continue partnering with civil society organizations, to continue advocating for improved learning outcomes, especially when it comes to the impact of this whole pandemic. But anyway, having given you an insight into what we have been able to do ourselves to respond to the pandemic, you can see as we have tried to do something, and there are so many responses that have been done by other actors, including Ministry of Education and Sports. But despite all these responses, the impact of COVID-19 on children's learning and well-being is massive, really, really massive. I don't want to emphasize that. And therefore, there is a lot more that needs to be done. So what are the implications of this massive interruption and what can be done? So in the next few slides, we share our reflections on that. So just behind, you can see that's the homestead in one of the districts in Eastern Uganda, where we had gone to monitor the study that I mentioned about with a joint study with the Uganda Kingdom Education Department and Mutesa One Royal University on continuing learning. I was there at that, it was sometime in September, but inside one of those little huts, there is a household where I had gone to interview myself. The household head had been selected as one of the respondents. And what I found at that time was commotion. So the wife of the household head had just collapsed. She was completely unconscious, and they had just called a village nurse to come and take care of the situation. And what had made her collapse was that because of her primary 7 girl, their last born actually, had just been impregnated, and she had eloped with a boy at the village. So the mother had just actually realized the girl had left and she couldn't take it in. So that is just an example. So the girl who had caused this whole commotion was called Martha. There are so many Marthas out there, so many Marthas out there who have fallen victim because of this pandemic. And just to echo the, go ahead. So, but at this moment, Martha's mother is suffering, just like many other mothers and fathers elsewhere because of the impact of this world pandemic. But in the long run, it's going to be the young people who are going to pay the price. And just to quote, to give a quotation from Das, Daniels, and Rabi 2020, they say that the hidden paradox of disasters is that even if those who suffer today are the elderly, like Martha's mother, those who will pay throughout their lives will be the youngest. There's no doubt about that. So what is the evidence then to really support this? That many of the young people are actually going to really pay the price. So just to first take you through the global situation, according to the white paper on education that I mentioned, which came out of the Save Our Future campaign, 90% of children in the world have had their education interrupted due to COVID-19. And in absolute numbers, it's about 1.7 billion children whose education has been interrupted. And yet, school is more than just a physical space. So the closure of schools means that the children cannot access some very important services like protection, and of course, access to, to something that could improve their health and nutrition. It's actually estimated that over 370 million kids are missing free and subsidized meals. Many of these kids were only getting a decent meal at school. When schools are closed, we can imagine what is happening. Also, it's estimated that 7.6 million kids are at risk of not returning to school due to early marriages or sexual exploitation. Some of those kids are in our respective countries. I know that people participating in this event are connecting from different countries. I saw Baila from Pakistan and so on. So we are contributing to these percentages in our respective countries. So taking this situation close to our country, Uganda, the education of 15 million children has been disrupted since March 2020. So it's great that in the last 2 months, schools were reopened for candidate classes at all levels, but that's a small percentage of kids. I think about between 10 to 15% of our school-going young people returned to school. We celebrate that because at least there is hope, something's happening. But majority of the learners remain out of school. And even if the schools will eventually reopen, children are likely to spend less time in school due to the strict SOPs, standard operating procedures. When you talk about social distancing of 2 meters in between, schools will be able to take on a few kids at a time, meaning that perhaps the students will be studying in shifts. That reduces their contact time and time on the task. So this is the situation which is lying ahead of us. So what are the implications of this disruption globally, but also now bringing it closer to our country, Uganda? What are the implications on the education and learning of the children? We should appreciate the fact that there is no country which has ever experienced a crisis of this magnitude in recent years. No country has ever experienced this disruption. So meaning that evidence on the implications of what this means is a bit scanty. But we can draw on the situation that existed before COVID-19 and try to anticipate what the impact might be. But we can also draw on research from other contexts which experienced related shocks. On our continent, we have countries in West Africa like Liberia and Sierra Leone, which experienced more or less a similar disruption because of Ebola, the Ebola disease, and schools were closed for some time, a couple of years ago. So we can draw on what they experienced, how they managed the system, to see if we can get some lessons to address the situation that is before us. But in terms of really summarizing what for us we see as the impact of this disruption of COVID-19 on the education sector, we know that there are quite a number of impacts, but within the short time that we have here, we shall share three major impacts. The number one is learning loss. So globally, COVID-19 has hit an education sector that was struggling, even if before the schools closed. It's estimated in that education white paper that I talked about, the Save Our Future education white paper, which was published a couple of months ago. It's estimated that more than half of 10-year-olds had not learned to read by the time COVID-19 set in. When we talk about 10-year-olds in our situation in Uganda, that's an equivalent of kids in primary 5. That is assuming that if they are progressing normally. So our primary 5, 10%, more than half, 50% were not actually learning before the COVID-19. They had not learned how to read. So the long run impact of the COVID-19 shock will be massive. The learning loss would be massive. If they were not learning before, what happens when schools have closed? It's almost coming to a year. It's now 9 to 10 months, and we don't know when they will reopen. And Kaffenberg 2020 has actually estimated that today's primary 3 learners will lose as much as 1.5 years of learning time by the time they're in grade 10. Grade 10 is like an equivalent of senior 2, senior 3 here. So they would have lost, put together, 1.5 years. It could even be more because it depends on context to context. So Uganda's situation is similar. Learning outcomes were extremely low even before the school closures. So one would expect that the situation will worsen unless something is done. And there is something definitely that can be done to ensure that we reduce the impact of this pandemic on the learning of our children. So we drew some evidence from our previous assessments, and one of the next. So yeah, so we draw evidence from our last national assessment was conducted in October 2018. The report was launched at the end of 2019. But basically, our assessment measures basic competences of literacy and numeracy of children who are aged between 6 and 16. Some of those, many of them are actually in school, some are not in school, some are in lower classes, some are in upper classes. So we do analyze different scenarios using this data. And the purpose is to provide evidence on the actual status of learning. So just to draw two to three slides from that data to actually demonstrate the fact that learning outcomes were still extremely low before the pandemic, and try to then maybe forecast what might happen when our schools eventually reopen. Please go back to the first slide, that one. So this is an example of the learning outcomes after doing the analysis, and the sample size involved here includes over 13,600 children who were between primary 3 and primary 7, meaning that they had completed at least a minimum of 2 years of primary education, and some had even completed like 6 years of primary education. And the way we develop our assessment items, they are pitched at a primary 2 level. So in this case, we are looking at the capacity or skills of these kids who are between P3 and P7 to read a primary 2 level story. I won't talk about all the findings, but if we look at what is in green, I'm assuming that what you see on the screen, you can see different colors, but I'm looking at color green, which is like, we are expecting all these kids between P3 and P5, almost 100%, to be able to read this short story and understand it, because it's a primary 2 story. These are P3 up to P7. But if we look at maybe primary 5, you look at the bar of primary 5, which is the equivalent of the global statistics we gave, where the government, the white paper on education estimated that 50% of those kids, 10-year-olds, in Uganda's case, they're P5, had not yet learned to read. The data is quite comparable. In Uganda's case, 39% had learned to read and comprehend by primary 7, which is almost like 40%, meaning 60% had not yet learned to read and comprehend by the time of the pandemic. The findings for the numeracy assessment are not different, but they're a little better. If you look at the numeracy, again, just look at primary 5. Again, looking at the colors, we're looking at blue, if you can see blue on your screen, that at primary 2 level, the highest operation is being able to divide. And these are really single digit divisions that we are talking about. So you would expect that these are P2 tasks, primary 2 tasks. Everyone in primary 3 up to P7, they would do this at ease. But by primary 5, almost, again, about 50% had not yet reached that level. That was, October 2018, way before the pandemic. The last set of evidence that we share here, again, to kickstart our conversation, is based on age. So in terms of age, we're looking at, if we look at, for example, the kids within this assessment, who are between the age of 10 to 14. We said 10 is about if somebody is progressing normally, they're in primary 5. Age 14, those should have, if they are progressing normally, they should have entered senior 1, the ordinary level. But in terms of these colors, if we actually start with the big one, which is purple, if you can see in your purple, oops. So the purple one actually indicates that even COVID-19, children between 10 to 14, their learning had been severely delayed by over 2 years. The ones in green, the learning had been severely delayed by at least 2 years. And in terms of those who are progressing really normally, are the ones who are highlighted in white. The ones highlighted in green were excellently progressing normally, more beyond expectations. So you can see that generally, if we just look at yellow and purple, most of the kids were really way below their age level before COVID-19. So what does this evidence that we've shared from our assessment actually imply on the future of learning of our children? To be positive, it is likely that children who are progressing normally, the ones, if we refer to the ones in green, in the literacy, then the blue bar, in part of the bar in numeracy, and then the ones in the age-based table, who were either white, in white color, or green, it's likely that those children will catch up quite easily, because by the time COVID-19 came in, they had acquired the basics of learning, the basics of reading, the basics of arithmetic, such that when schools eventually reopen, they will, of course, they will need some support because many of them are not learning at all, but it will be easy to have those catch up. The biggest challenge is going to be with those children who were already struggling before the pandemic. It means that if these are not identified and supported, they may never catch up, and many of them might fall off completely. So the next impact that we share here is the one on mental health. And again, there's evidence in the literature showing that a number of kids' mental health has been affected by the isolation from friends, the prolonged social distancing, which might actually increase, like I said, even when schools reopen, with the standard operating procedures of no play, keep a distance of 2 meters, this is going to continue into the system. And there's going to be massive impact on that, on the learning of the children. But also, I think we talked about the evidence on the kids who might not come back to school because of early pregnancies or early marriages. Some have been physically assaulted and so on. So quite a number of those kids may not come back to school. But even when the ones when we are lucky, they come back to school, and I think it should be our concerted effort to ensure that as many as possible kids return back to school. When they come, we should first attend to their mental health before we start pumping them with content. The last impact that we see of COVID-19 here is the one on the continuation of education. Again, drawing from evidence from the Ebola crisis in West Africa. In Liberia, for example, it was reported that approximately 25% of the kids, school-going kids, did not enter school after schools reopened. Schools had been closed because of the Ebola crisis, but by the time they reopened, 25% did not return. This percentage might be much bigger because of the COVID-19, because schools have been closed much longer. And yeah, then again, it's estimated from Sierra Leone that sexual violence and early pregnancy, because of the sexual violence and early pregnancy, about 10% of the kids in the most highly affected areas in Sierra Leone did not return to school because of early pregnancy. So the situation might be exactly the same here in Uganda, but also other developing countries. So what does this really mean to us in terms of recommendations, telling ourselves? For us, our first recommendation as an organization, and I believe this speaks to a number of people globally, but also nationally, is that we should ensure that we prioritize safe reopening of schools for all children. We celebrate the fact that in Uganda, schools were reopened for candidate classes. I think everybody is really happy. We can also draw good enough Ministry of Education is monitoring how that has gone. But again, since they were reopened, we haven't had so many cases erupting because the schools reopened. But also, there are cases in, an example here in West Africa is that schools reopened with preventive hygienic measures before the Ebola pandemic or disease was eradicated. But evidence shows actually that when schools reopened, the virus did not erupt again. Just because schools reopened, it didn't mean that Ebola just escalated. It was under control. But also the predictive models suggest that school closure alone will only reduce the number of COVID-19 deaths by up to 4%. That percentage is quite negligible. Of course, a life is a life. But the closure of schools does not mean that it drastically reduces the number of deaths. And in the US, the Center for Disease Control Director has actually noted that schools are among the safest places for kids. I don't think that finding is, or that observation is so different from our respective countries, including Uganda. I think when you look at what is happening to our children during the school closures, there are so many events that are happening. Churches and mosques are reopened, weddings are happening, burials are happening. You see quite a number of kids who are just roaming around the villages. In schools, they would be completely protected from this. So surely schools would be the safest space for our children to be. And much as the number of cases of COVID-19 are increasing each day, we think when the new year starts, we should find a way as a country to actually prioritize the reopening of schools for all learners. But of course, taking precautions and ensure that schools are reopened in a safe way. In Tanzania, next door, schools did not close. I don't know. Of course, there is openness of data and information, but we would have known if there were more deaths because schools remained opened. So there's something to draw there. And when schools reopen, as a second recommendation, when schools reopen, we should find a way of giving assessments to each child to try and understand the level at which they're coming. We already indicated from our data that a number of kids were not really learning at all before COVID-19. Many of these kids' situation would have worsened completely. So if we start teaching them as if assuming that they are all learning at the same level, then we shall be beating our own efforts. So we need to find a way, a measure of establishing at which level each child is so that each one of them is supported from the level at which they are. And we believe that our assessment tool, the Uwezo Learning Assessment Tool of Literacy and Numeracy, is a very powerful tool that can be used. And we can, as an organization, contribute to enabling teachers in schools to use the tool and at least assess for primary school kids where they are in terms of literacy and numeracy and where they can be supported. But we also want to think that as a country, we should prioritize the issue of remedial teaching and learning. We know that every teacher is expected to do some remediation for children who are not lagging behind, but that is left to the discretion of each teacher. We think this should be centralized to ensure that on the timetable, we have some time, at least maybe 2 hours every day, for schools and teachers and classrooms to assess where these kids are so that those who are lagging behind are supported to actually catch up without necessarily asking learners to repeat classes. But also number 3, as a recommendation, we want to say that because of the effect on the mental health of children, that schools and teachers should also be supported and equipped to support the well-being of all children. So first of all, we need to attend to the well-being of teachers themselves. Many of them have been completely stressed, especially those working in private schools without any source of income. We need to first support them, attend to their mental health, but also prepare them to be able to attend to the mental health of the children before real serious teaching and learning happens. But before schools reopen, but also after they have reopened, there should be we should maintain some form of learning in communities and creating links between schools and communities. I think this is one of the advantages of the COVID-19, that we started thinking about how do we ensure that children continue learning at home in communities when schools are closed. That kind of initiative should actually continue. It should continue even when schools are reopened. So we applaud government's efforts to ensure that there has been continued learning through radio, through TV. We also hear of the project of providing radios to every household by government. That probably should continue because the radios can be used to actually support learning even when schools reopen. But I think another effort should be to ensure that we continue giving reading materials to these households, because a lesson on radio is taught once and it might never happen again. But a reading something which is on text can be used by the kids now, but also kids in the future. So that kind of effort should actually continue. As I conclude, as an organization, we are resolved to support the tasks of the education sector in adapting to and recovering from the emergency. We did some work when the pandemic set in, and we are committing to continue that effort in the new year. And just a highlight of the things that we are planning to do in the new year to respond to this pandemic. We are planning to do a national learning assessment of young people between 6 and 16, but also an assessment of young people between 14 and 20 to try and generate evidence on the status of learning. I think this evidence was needed even yesterday as schools reopen nationally. We need to get some evidence on the learning losses that we have made, or even some gains, because there are quite a number of interventions that have happened to continue supporting the learning of children. But we shall also continue advocating and doing some action on remedial teaching and learning, knowing that many of our kids were lagging behind before the COVID-19, and the situation might have worsened because of the school closures. We have an opportunity to work closely with us Strengthening Education Systems for Learning program, which is an initiative of the FDCO, the government, the UK government, in partnership with the government of Uganda, where they've actually already conceptualized this of implementing community-led learning, where you have in specific communities volunteers who have been trained and given content appropriate to primary 1 and 2 to teach these kids, groups of about 15, teaching them literacy and numeracy. And we are happy to work with them to kind of collect baseline and endline data on that intervention, which is extremely potentially useful to improving learning outcomes of our children. We plan to do an absenteeism and enrollment study. We know that when schools reopen, a few kids may not enroll, because already about 87% had not yet enrolled before COVID-19. That number the percentage might increase, but also absenteeism might also increase, because I mean, what happens if one is not able to catch up? They either drop out or they continuously absent themselves because they don't see any value. So we want to see what would be the causes of that, which could be, some of the causes could be in the communities or households, others could be actually in the schools themselves. But we shall also continue monitoring our SMS campaign to try and understand the immediate effect this made, but also how we could improve a similar intervention in future. And we shall also continue with some of our studies that Farida mentioned under Goal 2, on studies that can demonstrate what works to improve learning outcomes. We are conducting a study on community-based preschools, because our evidence and evidence all over the world has indicated that kids who have had access of at least 2 years of preschool, here we call it nursery education, they actually are much more skilled in terms of literacy and numeracy than their counterparts who never attended any preschool. But we have also a study in the refugee areas, because you know, one of the populations that is going to be affected gravely by this pandemic are those who were already disadvantaged before the COVID-19. And in Uganda, we have this situation of the refugee hosting districts. We have schools which enroll a number of big populations of refugees, and there has been no much study done on what the resources and learning environment is for those schools which enroll quite a number of kids. There are huge, large classes, and so there are large classes in those areas. We need to do a systematic study on this, because as schools reopen, still some of these schools which had large numbers of kids, hopefully if something is done, they will continue having this number of kids. So how do you handle such kids when they're at different levels? Many of them have fallen off. So basically, this is in summary what we are planning to do. And thank you so much for participating in this conversation, and look forward to hearing your views. Those are some of the references. You can flash the first one. Next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Goretti, for that very detailed and elaborate presentation on the challenging times we are facing and implications on learning. In the next session, we are really going to have a free discussion. Comments, reactions to Dr. Goretti's presentation, kindly address them to the chat room. We will pick them there and highlight them for discussion. But in a way, Dr. Goretti's presentation has focused us on the learning outcomes before the COVID pandemic, and triggering us to think through where are we headed to with regards to educational challenges that were existing before, and how we will continue to move to address these, and with the continuous learning that government is supporting with, to see how we shall continue to ensure that all children are equitably learning? Will there be learning losses or gains? Should we anticipate that with the current pandemic continuing to rampage, will there be further challenges? Or would we think that, or stay hopeful that we will get back to the situation that was before the pandemic? Participants, please address your comments in the chat room or any questions with regard to the discussion we've been having.
And as we wait for the comments, let me take this opportunity to welcome the chair of Uwezo Uganda Board, Professor James Albert Lutalo-Bosa. You're most welcome, Professor. Yeah.
I think as more come, we can start with what we have received so far. Some of them are comments, some are words of encouragement. There's one from Ricardo Sabat from the Real Center. He says it's really interesting to see the outstanding work that you are doing. And he's looking forward to learning lessons about testing children using phones, which we can also broadly share with colleagues from ASA India for another project that is being collaborated on. Patrick Kaboyo says that now that we cannot hold a Uwezo Sports Challenge, where staff can play soccer against members of the advisory committee, can we organize any program along this line? Not sports, but maybe a national debate. And then he also congratulates us on having excellently done well in the 1 year. Grace from Joy. Some well-off parents are paying privately for teachers to teach their children. This is happening mainly in urban villages. This means even when schools resume, not all children will be at the same level. Of course, again, it relates to the issues around the learning losses and the learning gains and the need to reflect on how children will continue to catch up, especially when schools reopen. And we know that government is also undertaking monitoring visits in schools to plan for a reopening of schools. So there's need to reflect on that. Then there's also another comment still from Grace. If government empowers these teachers on ground with learning materials for learners, this means most children in the villages would at least find a teacher to go to for 1 to 2 hours interaction of learning. If government empowers these teachers on ground with learning materials for learners, this means most children in the villages would at least find a teacher to go to for 1 or 2 hours of interaction to aid learning. Among the participants, we have colleagues from the Ministry of Education. We have Hajat Safina Mutumba, we have Senkali Harriet, the Principal Education Officer from the Ministry of Education and Sports. You can as well, please feel free to address some of those comments, especially those related to issues of learning materials. We know a lot has been done in that area. So please feel free where you need to and respond to some of those questions. Gority, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Farida, and thank you very much, distinguished participants, for not only attending this event, but also taking your time to listen in carefully and give us feedback on this. Professor Ricardo of Rio Center, Cambridge Education, thank you so much for your comment. And we look forward to further engagement in the new year. And yes, we can share a little bit more on the findings or the methodology of the phone-based assessment. One of our partners in the People's Action for Learning Network, I think Young Love in Botswana, they actually did something like this and published a paper. But what they did for them to do the phone-based assessment. What we have done for us is to compare the phone-based assessment with a face-to-face assessment, and the findings are quite interesting. Like I said, there's a slight improvement in learning outcomes when they are assessed via phone, and one of the analysis that we've done, Hello World has done with us is that you cannot rule out the fact that there's always that external assistance from the parents or the peers. It happens when schools give homework, for example, to kids. Parents are tempted to actually help. Perhaps that also happens with the distance assessment, but I think this is a methodology that is worth investigating, because we don't know when this pandemic will end, and we need more data on the learning outcomes. So the phone-based assessment provides some kind of promise to this. Mr. Kaboyo, yes, in the new year we should plan for the Uwezo Uganda Technical Advisory Committee Challenge. It could be a national debate or even sports, why not? But thank you so much for your support as a member of the advisory committee. We appreciate that. I think the two comments from our partner, Grace, Joy Uganda, PG District. You're very right. What is happening at the moment, I think if we are not careful as a country, but which is an issue which might happen to all developing countries, the gap between the rich and the poor is going to be completely widened, because as the government was trying to give printed materials, and what quite a number of schools were already engaging their kids in online learning. And some parents have even hired teachers to come into their homes to teach these kids. So as Farida was saying, indeed, when we receive back these kids when schools have reopened, they are going to be at different levels. And it's the responsibility of the education sector through the schools and our teachers to try then and establish the level at which each child is going to re-enter school. And it's only when we know the levels at which they are that we shall be able to support them and ensure that no child is left behind. And this is an area for us, as I said, we are going to participate actively with the Ministry of Education to ensure that, and of course also other development partners, to ensure that the teaching happens at the right level. There should be some kind of a measure to assess where the children are. And we believe that the Uwezo tool that we use for the learning assessment, for the best learning assessment, can be effectively used as an assessment tool when schools have reopened to establish where children are in literacy and numeracy in the lower classes, but also in upper classes. Our evidence shows that even by the time they reach P7, some of them have not learned how to read and do simple arithmetic. So all of them need to maybe be assessed in some way, because if they don't get the foundation, these foundations of reading, they will never catch up. Never. So if we need to do that. And yes, Grace, you're very right. Hopefully, and I think that is one of the campaigns that we shall also continue doing as government continues the effort to provide radios to households and promoting the radio teaching and so on. I think the issue of providing materials, reading materials, both the teachers but also the learners, will be very important, because when schools reopen, schools and teachers will be under pressure to cover the syllabus. So if the kids already have these materials, it would be easy, probably. It would become easier, not easy really, it becomes a bit easier for them to have a reference, but also to be assisted by individual teachers. But even being assisted by some of the more able peers within their households and communities. Yeah, so it's a comment that we welcome. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Goretti. We have about 3 more. Participants, kindly bear with us. In the interest of time, we shall individually respond to those that we have not attended to. But let's look through these 3 or 4. Yovani Moses Lubale notes that while in Yumbe 2 weeks ago, primary 7 was supposed to have 62 children, but instead it had 45. So we are really seeing reduced number of children attending school, and an indication that possibly there's dropouts already at this point. Then he also further adds that what will government do for children who have studied throughout during the lockdown? Some have even done examinations and excelled. I'm sure the colleagues from government, including also Dr. Lusambu, we welcome you. Please feel free to attend to any of those questions where need be. We shall also as well follow up and give the respective responses just in case our partners are unable to provide any responses at this time. Then Joseph Semakula, is it possible to have a question included, I guess, in the researches that we've highlighted that we'll undertake, focusing on teachers of basic education? He says he can explain if we give him chance. Otherwise, congratulations. And then Tom Musira, remedial teaching is a good suggestion. However, it requires much effort, coordination, and proper planning. It is in view of the fact that most schools focus on syllabus coverage and hardly value remedial teaching as a priority. So I think that is for us to note, especially as we plan to undertake studies in that context.
That's right. I think they told me there's somebody.
Yes, Joseph Semakula. Joseph Semakula is still online?
Yes, I'm online.
Yeah, kindly throw more light on the question you.
Yeah, the question stems from a background that on the National Teachers' Day, in the preparations, I managed to meet Tueheyo and I introduced myself to him as part of Uwezo, and he admired me, oh, yes. Then I asked him, you've organized the National Teachers' Day where teachers are going to meet the head of state. Do we have any primary school teachers that are coming basic education? And when he got out the segmentation, actually there was none from basic education. Then government is trying to support teachers. There's a circle, money has been given, and the teachers of basic education are basically excluded from that stratification. Now, when we are, as Uwezo, we are doing this assessment, could we add something? Because we've seen from media, primary school teachers going to wash clothes, go in the homes of where they teach. Can we have a question focusing on them, like, what have you been doing? What are you doing now? Or if we're in a school, how many teachers are available now and how many have left and why? How many are willing to come back? So that Uwezo can show the impact of teachers of basic education that have left teaching, because it will have an implication on learning. That was my suggestion. Otherwise, thank you so much. And I'm proud to have been part of Uwezo. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Gority, the next 2 minutes.
No, thank you. Really, thank you so much. Dr. Semakula will definitely take on that advice. And as a good thing is that when we are developing our survey tool, so in addition to the learning assessment of testing kids in literacy and numeracy, we also have a school survey and a household survey. But in the school survey, we'll definitely ensure that we include some of those critical questions, and we shall do it in a very consultative manner, so that we include questions that have that can inform the education sector. Yes, Professor Yovan, I think your question indeed reaffirms the importance of the research that we have planned to do towards that will be Q4 in 2021 on the issue of absenteeism, but also non-enrollment. It's highly likely that there's going to be increased non-enrollment even when schools will open. We also saw that evidence in the context of West Africa during the Ebola crisis. So I think we can't just leave it like that. There might be need for evidence on the extent of this, but also the causes of that and how we could mitigate it. And yes, the question on what government should do, like we said, I think the gap between the rich and the poor is widening completely. It's us as an education sector to kind of address it. And we also don't want a situation whereby you have kids who are already there. You remember that statistics that we gave of literacy and numeracy, but also the age-based. Those are already excelling very well. You don't want also to keep them so lagging behind. That is where the issue of assessing and trying to establish the level at which the children or students are, so that each one of them is taught at the right level where they are, is very important. So some of them have already acquired, all the skills. So can they be then taught, maybe engaged in more, in higher level activities, instead of treating them and say, oh, everybody must have lagged behind. Start with the P2 text story for them to read. I think trying to understand where each one is and try to teach them at the right level would be very important, but also to emphasize the fact that for us, learning is not just about passing exams. It's about acquiring some of these foundation skills, but also some skills that are needed in the 21st century. Things like critical thinking, problem solving. For those who have already maybe attained the best, can the education system maybe try to engage them in higher level activities to sharpen their problem thinking, problem solving and critical thinking skills, in addition to just merely passing exams. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone. And we really appreciate your comment. And I think Farida has asked me that at this particular time, I take the opportunity to welcome the chair of Uwezo Uganda Board, who is Professor Albert Lutalo Bosa, to give some remarks and close this event. Professor Lutalo Bosa is a legend of education in Uganda. Formerly, he was Vice Chancellor of Chambogo University. For those of you who are familiar with Uganda's education system, Chambogo University is a leading university in teacher education, special needs education, and engineering. And for a number of years, Professor Lutalo was the Vice Chancellor of that university. He also chairs the NAPE. NAPE is National Assessment of Progress in Education, which is a program managed by Ministry of Education under Uganda National Examinations Board. So he chairs the board of that assessment in Uganda, but also currently he is the Vice Chancellor of Timu University. Timu University is one of the private universities in Uganda. So he's still a very busy professor, but amidst all his business, he finds some time to guide Uwezo Uganda as the chair of the board. You're most welcome, Professor Lutalo Bosa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Goreti, the Executive Director of Uwezo Uganda. My very sincere apology. I planned to be with you right from the beginning, and I got locked up in a traffic jam. And when I realized that I can't make it, that's why I called you and said, please get started. And so I'm happy that I've made it at the tail end of the session. A lot has been said, I'm sure, by the Executive Director. You know, Uwezo Uganda is now an independent entity. It is no longer standing under the wings of Uwezo, which we knew for a long time. Unfortunately, yes, coincidentally, at the time of starting to operate as an independent entity, it is the same time that we had a COVID-19 lockdown. And everything was very, very difficult, to say the least, because we couldn't know exactly how to move, where we wanted to move. We couldn't, because many of our stakeholders could not participate the way they would have loved to participate. But as you've been informed by the Executive Director, something has been done during the course of the year. We're celebrating the first year of our existence, and in spite of all the challenges, we've been able to do something that could be done under the circumstances. We realize that definitely there is a lot of uncertainty, and we can't predict exactly what will be there in another 3 months. So the policy as a board we have taken is that we are going to keep vigilant and make adjustments wherever it is possible to make adjustments. You've just been told that 7 plan areas have been identified for the coming year. But who knows whether we shall be able to implement them fully. We may have to make some adjustments again as we go along because the environment is still very fluid and we can't say with certainty what we should be expected done. But at least we have plans. Remember, especially the members of the Technical Advisory Committee, that before the Uwezo Uganda was launched, we had already had some strategies which we had agreed upon. Those will keep guiding us as we move on. And as it has been mentioned to you, the 7 plan areas are the ones that we have identified we're going to start with, but we will see where we make adjustments as necessary as we move along. But I would like at this point in time to thank immensely all our stakeholders that have been supportive even during this very challenging period. The partners and all these other people that we work with in the field, because we don't work alone. The Secretariat, yes, plans, but we have to solicit a lot of support from the stakeholders. We thank you all and please beg you to continue working with us because we're still focusing on the theme of learning outcomes as far as this country is concerned. Secondly, every dark cloud, as they say, has a silver lining. We are going to have to adjust and look at some of the most urgent things to look at as we move along. What has been the impacts of COVID-19 as far as learning is concerned? You've already been told, certainly, that without stretching our imaginations too much, there are going to be disparities in the levels of learning, or the children have continued to learn at school. How do we handle that? How do we advise the players to move on with the class, with people, with the disparities in the level of learning, or level of knowledge they should have? Definitely, the teachers must be assisted, must be strengthened, must have the capacity to identify these disparities so that they can handle it. Because if you don't identify them, you won't find a way and the right way to approach or how to assist the learners who might be lagging behind others. So all these things we are going to try and do, but we would like to continue and beg you to continue with our support. And whenever we call upon you to solicit some ideas from the communities, from society, from the other leaders in various areas, please come and join hands with us because we feel the job is still there to be done and we can only do it if we all work together. My sincere apology again, Executive Director, that I was not with you right from the beginning, but I'm happy that I've caught you at the tail end of the exercise, and I would like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a happy and successful New Year. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lutalo-Bosa, for those very enriching closing remarks. And before we bid farewell to the rest of the participants, we request you to join us in cutting the first year anniversary cake. And members who are joining online, please join us in spirit as we cut the cake. Hope you can see it. Please join us. But please, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Farida, for moderating this event. We thank our colleagues at the Secretariat, the communications team, which put this together. And we end up with the cutting of the cake led by the chairperson of the board of Uwezo Uganda, Professor Lutalo.
You join me. Uwezo, Uganda.
So counting. 1,
3, 2, 1, 0.
Thank you. We shall send a
Long
knee.
live Uwezo.
Thank you very much. So we shall send a knee cake to our partners. Dashin? I think we get this.
Thank you very much, members, for joining in. We really appreciate the time you put into this. As our partners, we don't take this for granted. We strongly believe that we can always rely on you on this robust journey that we are setting forth. Thank you very, very much, and we wish you happy holidays. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much. The cake is delicious.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Professor Kutoya. Thanks for coming. You came right on time.
I missed this body.